In the sleepy suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri, on a quiet street lined with modest two-story homes and maple trees already dusting the sidewalks with the golden edges of early autumn, Ethan Parker lived in a house that had not changed much since the day he bought it 10 years ago. The paint was chipped in some corners, the gutters sagged slightly, and the grass grew in uneven tufts along the edge of the driveway. He had never minded those imperfections. They suited him. At 36, Ethan was the kind of man who avoided eye contact in grocery store lines, refused to wave back at neighbors, and preferred silence over small talk. He worked remotely as a data analyst for a logistics company, and most days his routine was fixed, calculated down to the minute. He made his coffee at exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, checked his inbox at 7:15, and began the first of his 4 daily client calls at 8. The window by his kitchen overlooked the backyard, which happened to share a borderline tree with a house next door, a towering old oak with sprawling branches, beloved by birds and squirrels alike, and also beloved by one other creature, Margaret Bell, aged 82, widow, retiree, and Ethan's unwanted morning interruption. Every day, without fail, Margaret would emerge from her back door between 7 o'clock and 7:15, carrying a small floral print tote bag filled with peanuts. She'd shuffle out in her pink house slippers, her curly gray hair tucked under a lavender sun hat, and cross the narrow lawn that separated her garden from Ethan's property. Her gait was slow but determined. She always walked the same way, past the bird bath, around the rose bushes, and up to the base of the oak. There, she would scatter peanuts into a small dish nailed to the trunk, mutter something to the squirrels, and sit on the old bench for a few minutes before heading back inside. Every day, just as reliably, Ethan would open a window above his sink and shout the same words, "Crazy old lady, go back home." The first time it had happened, it was out of frustration. The sound of her footsteps crunching over leaves had broken his concentration during a stressful video call. But then it became a thing, a weird, private ritual. Something in the way she barely reacted, never offended, sometimes just lifting a hand in a lazy wave, irked him, or maybe, deep down, intrigued him. Either way, the shouting became part of his morning. It wasn't angry, not anymore. It was more like punctuation, like tapping the side of a mug before a sip. Pointless, but necessary. The neighbors noticed, of course. The woman across the street, Donna, sometimes smirked when she heard it through her open window. A man walking his dog once laughed out loud when he caught the exchange. But nobody said anything. Margaret didn't complain. Ethan didn't care. And so the ritual continued, day after day, season after season. Snow, rain, heat, or wind, Margaret came out, and Ethan shouted. On this particular Monday, a late September morning with just enough chill to make the window glass sweat with condensation, Ethan stood in his kitchen as usual. He poured his coffee, took his first sip, and opened the window. The clock read 7:10. He waited. The oak stood still. A squirrel darted up the bark, pausing at the dish, which was empty. Ethan leaned forward, squinting. No sign of Margaret. By 7:15, he was frowning. He checked the clock again. Then again. It wasn't just that she was late. She was never late. Not once in the 6 years they had shared that strange, wordless morning standoff. A small, irrational annoyance began to needle at him, like missing a punchline you were expecting. He kept glancing at the yard every few minutes, distracted from his emails. His calls were a blur of voices and charts he barely registered. At noon, he stepped onto his back porch for the first time in weeks, pretending to inspect a loose screen, but really just hoping to catch a glimpse of her through her window. Nothing. By 3 o'clock, the unease had grown into something more persistent. He opened the window one last time, leaned out, and listened. The backyard was quiet, save for the rustling of branches and the occasional chirp. That's when he noticed something unusual. Taped to Margaret's back door was a small, white square that flapped slightly in the breeze. He stared at it. It could be anything. A delivery note, instructions for a repairman. But it was new. Ethan didn't remember deciding to cross the lawn. He just did. The grass was damp and cool under his socks. He hadn't walked this way in years. Up close, the oak seemed taller, the bench more weathered. He paused at the door, then reached the note. The handwriting was large and loopy, written in blue ink, to the man in the window. Today the squirrels will have to wait. I had to go to the hospital. Thank you for keeping my routine interesting all these years. With affection, Margaret. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. He read it again, and again. There was something strangely formal in her words, something final. He looked around the empty yard. The dish was still empty. The squirrels had scattered. The bench sat vacant beneath the tree, and the sunlight was beginning to slip behind the rooftops. He didn't go back to his computer. He didn't check his inbox. He sat on his own back steps until the sky turned navy blue and the crickets took over the quiet. The next morning, for the first time in years, he did not open the window to shout. He only listened, and the silence felt unbearable. Ethan Parker did not sleep well that night. The house felt unfamiliar in its silence, like something subtle had shifted, tilting the floor beneath his feet just enough to make standing still uncomfortable. He tossed between the sheets, his room too warm, then too cold. At one point, he got up and checked the backyard again to the blinds, as though expecting to see her out there in the dark, shuffling around with her bag of peanuts under the moonlight. She wasn't, of course. He knew she wouldn't be. And yet, sleep eluded him until just before dawn. He woke late the next morning, already irritated. The sun was higher than usual, and for a moment, he forgot what had changed. But when he wandered into the kitchen and looked toward the window, it all returned. The silence, the empty yard, the weight of that small note with its careful, grandmotherly handwriting still folded and propped on the kitchen table. He hadn't thrown it away. He wasn't sure why. There was a tension under his skin now, something more than discomfort. It wasn't just a break in routine. It was the note itself and what it implied. Hospital. The word echoed each time he saw her handwriting. There were no details, no contact number, not even a date, just a strange, almost affectionate farewell wrapped in a tone too warm for someone he'd shouted at daily for years. He avoided his laptop and didn't check his email. He kept hovering near the window, waiting out of habit. And when 7 o'clock came, and went again with no movement from the house next door, he found himself pacing, arms crossed, heart beating too fast for someone who insisted he didn't care. At noon, he finally left the house. He hadn't walked the neighborhood in a long time. Everything looked oddly the same, hedges trimmed, driveways swept, wind chimes tinkling softly in the late September breeze. But the air felt heavier. When he reached the sidewalk and glanced across the street, he saw Donna watering her front garden, humming tunelessly, wearing her usual visor and blue gardening gloves. For a moment, he hesitated. He didn't like small talk, but the question in his chest burned too hot. He cleared his throat. "Hey, Donna." She looked up, surprised. It was the first time Ethan had spoken to her since last year, when a broken branch from her maple tree had fallen into his yard, and he'd left a passive-aggressive note about it. "Well, hello, stranger," she said, smiling. "Everything all right?" He scratched the back of his neck, uncomfortable already. "Do you know what happened to Margaret?" Her expression softened. She turned off the hose and took off one glove. She had a fall a few days ago. Just tripped in the kitchen. Nothing dramatic. But with her age, they took her in to run some tests. I think her niece finally convinced her to stay overnight. That woman hates hospitals. Did she say anything before she left? Donna tilted her head, as if trying to read more in his voice than he intended to show, only that she'd miss her squirrels. He hesitated again. "She left me a note." Donna's eyebrows lifted. "Did she now?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "Called me the man in the window. Said thanks for keeping her routine interesting." Donna didn't laugh or smile, just nodded slowly. "You know, she used to call you her grumpy audience. Said it made her feel like she was on stage every morning. I yelled at her," he said plainly, "every day." "I know," Donna said gently. She never minded. He wasn't sure what to do with that. So he nodded stiffly, murmured something that might have been thanks, and walked back home, more restless than before. That evening, he sat by the window again, but there was no satisfaction in the stillness. The The tree looked wrong without her beneath it, like the stage lights were on, but the performer was missing. That night, he pulled out a notepad he hadn't used in years and stared at the blank paper. He didn't know how to begin. Dear Margaret felt too formal. Hey, old lady, too cruel, even if it had once been a joke. In the end, he settled on nothing at all. He just wrote sentence after sentence, scratching through some, rewriting others. He didn't apologize directly. It didn't feel like she needed that, but he tried to be honest. He wrote that the silence felt worse than the noise ever did. That mornings without her were wrong. That he wasn't sure why it mattered so much. But it did. He folded the letter carefully, stepped out onto the lawn before sunrise the next day, and pinned it to the bark of the oak tree with a small silver thumbtack. Then he scattered a handful of raw peanuts at the base, clumsy and awkward, before retreating inside. The ritual felt different now. Not performative, not obligatory, but necessary. The next day, there was still no Margaret. And the day after that, nothing again. Each morning, he repeated the gesture, a few words scribbled on paper, a few peanuts dropped at the base of the tree, and then a moment of quiet before turning back inside. He didn't know if anyone was reading his notes. Maybe Donna was watching, maybe no one was, but it became his new ritual anyway, a way to fill the gap she had left behind. By the end of the week, the kitchen windowsill was lined with tiny crumpled messages. Some funny, some rambling, one or two even a little bitter. All of them for someone who had never once yelled back. On the seventh day, he stood by the tree a little longer. The sun was brighter than usual, casting long shadows through the oak leaves. Squirrels darted closer now, unbothered by his presence. One of them approached the dish slowly, as if expecting something more. Ethan chuckled under his breath. Well, he muttered, at least someone's reading these. He turned to go when he heard a voice from behind. You've been feeding them wrong. He froze. The voice was faint, familiar and dry as paper. Slowly, he turned around, but there was no one there. Only the tree, the dish, the wind, a trick of the breeze, he told himself. His own mind, echoing a memory. Still, that night he couldn't shake the sound of it, sharp, knowing, and unmistakably her. And that was the moment Ethan decided silence wasn't enough anymore. He had to find her. By the 8th morning, the squirrels had begun to wait for him. They gathered beneath the oak tree just after sunrise, twitching and scurrying, their small eyes expectant. It had been a week since Margaret's last appearance, and Ethan's early days of fumbling awkwardness had slowly evolved into something almost methodical. He had learned which nuts they preferred, how much to scatter, and how close he could sit before they grew wary. Each morning, after leaving his offering, he would sit on the steps, coffee in hand, and watch them for a few minutes before beginning his day. But what had started as a placeholder for Margaret's absence was shifting into something else. It was no longer about pretending her routine hadn't been broken. It was about acknowledging that something essential had gone missing from his life, and he didn't know how to get it back. That morning, the silence felt heavier than usual. There was an overcast stillness in the sky, and the wind moved slow, dragging the leaves across the lawn like a sigh. He fed the squirrels, folded his latest note, and pinned it to the tree. Then, instead of going back inside, he stood there for a long time, facing the quiet house next door. The curtains in her back window were still drawn. The small ceramic gnome near her garden was tipped over, half buried in mulch. No one had been by. No family, no nurse, not even the mailman had left anything new. He turned back toward his house, but paused when he saw the movement across the street. Donna was coming down her front steps, keys in hand. She paused when she saw him, raising a hand in a brief wave. Ethan didn't wave back, but he did cross the street. She looked surprised. "Morning, Ethan." "I want to know where she is," he said, skipping the awkwardness entirely. "What hospital?" Donna didn't answer immediately. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, studying him. "Why now?" "I've been writing her notes every day, leaving peanuts for the squirrels, talking to no one. I don't even know if she's okay." "She's stable," Donna said carefully. "She had a scan. They kept her longer than she wanted, I need to see her. Donna hesitated. It's not really my place to. I'm not asking for gossip. I'm asking because I shouted at her every morning for 6 years and never once bothered to learn anything about her, not even her birthday. That seemed to land. Donna tilted her head, her expression softening. She opened her bag and pulled out a small slip of paper. Her niece left this with me in case someone needed to reach her. They expected I'd be the one asking. Ethan took it before she could change her mind. A name, St. Luke's West, and a room number. Simple. He folded it, nodded once, and turned back toward his house without another word. Later that day, he found himself sitting in the parking lot of St. Luke's West, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel. Hospitals made him uneasy. They always had. The smell of antiseptic, the buzz of fluorescent lighting, the false cheer in the waiting rooms. But the thought of doing nothing was worse. He took a breath, pocketed the note, and went inside. The nurse at the front desk didn't ask many questions. Margaret was still listed as receiving non-critical care, recovering from a minor fall and further observation. Ethan gave his name and was told she was allowed visitors, but that she had been resting a lot. When he reached her room, he hovered just outside the door. It was ajar, enough to let in the light from the hallway. Inside, the room was quiet. Margaret sat upright in bed, a tray of untouched applesauce and crackers beside her. Her lavender hat was perched on the windowsill, and a vase of artificial flowers sat by the television. Her eyes were closed. Her hands rested in her lap, still and folded. He knocked gently. Her eyes opened, slow but alert. She blinked at him for a moment, as though trying to place him. Then her lips lifted in the smallest smirk. Look what the squirrel dragged in. He let out a short laugh, surprised. I wasn't sure if he'd recognize me without the window frame. Hard to miss that voice, dear, she said, and motioned toward the chair near her bed. You came. I did. She didn't speak right away. Just looked at him, quiet, examining. I thought about you, she said finally, every morning. Wondered if the squirrels were disappointed. They miss you, he said, but not as much as I do. Margaret smiled again, this time more softly. You were always so loud. I know. I liked it. That silenced him. She continued. I figured you needed to let something out. We all do. I'd rather be the target of a reliable shout than forgotten altogether. I wasn't trying to forget you, he said, his voice low. I didn't even really think of it that way until you were gone. It was just a habit. I thought you didn't care. Oh, I cared, she said, but not in the way you think. You reminded me that I still existed to someone, even if it was just as the crazy old lady next door. I didn't mean that, he said quickly. You did at first, she said without malice, but I knew it would change. Why? Because people get tired of being alone, even the angry ones. That made something tighten in his chest. He looked down at his hands, unsure how to answer. I heard you've been writing me letters, she added after a pause. I didn't know how else to talk to you. They're good, she said. Donna's been bringing them. He blinked. She didn't say that. She didn't need to. You weren't writing them for her. He nodded, more to himself than to her. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know. I never even asked your name. You never needed to. You already gave me one. Old lady. I've had worse. They sat in silence for a while. The light from the window stretched across the floor, soft and golden. Outside, a bird landed on the sill, then fluttered off again. I'm going home in a few days, she said. They want to keep me for one more round of tests. Then I'll be there when you get back. To shout again? He shook his head. To sit with you, if that's all right. Margaret smiled, a real one this time, full of life and something deeper than amusement. It's more than all right. Margaret didn't return home that week. The doctors, cautious and overly thorough, had ordered a few additional tests after detecting a slight irregularity in her heartbeat. Ethan visited again 2 days after their first real conversation, and this time the door to her hospital room was wide open when he arrived. She was awake, sitting up straighter than before, her tray cleared, her lavender hat now resting on her lap. She greeted him with a simple nod and a smirk that had become strangely familiar. There was no awkwardness between them, at least not anymore. The strange ritual that had bound them for so long had shattered and reformed into something gentler, something real. He brought a small plastic bag filled with peanuts and raisins. When she looked at it, puzzled, he shrugged and said, "For the squirrels, if they ever decide to visit you here." That made her laugh, a short, raspy sound that made him grin, without realizing it. She opened the bag, picked out a single raisin, and held it between her fingers. "You know I never fed them raisins," she said. "Too much sugar. Bad for their little teeth. You were more health-conscious with them than I've ever been with myself." "I was responsible for them," she said. "Someone has to look after the things that don't ask to be looked after." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but heavy in its own way. Ethan sat beside her, unsure how to respond. He was still adjusting to this version of Margaret, the one who spoke not in pleasantries or wordless waves, but in sentences that hinted at entire lifetimes. He could see the wear in her hands, the fine tremble in her fingertips, the deliberate calm in her voice. There was a strength to her that he had never noticed before, or maybe he had never bothered to look. "I didn't know you had family," he said after a while. "I don't really," she replied, setting the raisin down untouched. "A niece in Chicago, but she's more my husband's blood than mine. She checks in, makes the calls. But we were never close. No children of our own, just the squirrels and the neighbors and the quiet." He hesitated. "That's hard." "It was lonely at first," she said plainly. "But then, one day, you started yelling at me. And for some reason, that made everything better." He shook his head, almost smiling. "I still can't believe you didn't hate me for that." "Hate you?" "Ethan, I waited for it. I listened for it. Every morning, I'd sit on the edge of the bed and think, let's see what the grump has to say today." It was ridiculous. It was rude. But it was real. He studied her face, the deep-set lines, the small, knowing smile, the glint in her eye that didn't belong to someone defeated by age. She was sharp, mischievous even, the kind of woman who had learned not to be bothered by nonsense because life had offered her far worse things to worry about. "It wasn't personal," he said. "I know," she replied, "but I made it personal anyway, because I needed it to be." He looked away, his gaze settling on the sterile white wall, the laminated safety chart pinned to a corkboard, the plastic vase of plastic flowers. "I used to be different. Before this job. Before everything." She waited. "I had a brother," he continued. "Matt, older than me by 2 years. He was loud, charismatic, the kind of guy people remembered. I was always the quiet one. When our parents died, he handled everything. I didn't even speak at the funeral. Then he got sick. Pancreatic cancer. It happened fast. I couldn't even process it before it was over." Margaret didn't interrupt. "I never told him how much I leaned on him, how much I resented that I couldn't be more like him. After he died, I moved here, started working from home, thought isolation would make it easier, but it just solidified things." He paused, cleared his throat. "I think that's what the shouting was. Not at you, just at life, at the quiet, at the fact that no one was watching anymore. And then I showed up with my bag of peanuts and ruined your clean little bubble," she said gently. "Something like that." She reached out and tapped the back of his hand, her touch light but firm. "You don't have to stay angry to stay afloat, Ethan. Sometimes being noticed is enough to keep someone going. And sometimes being the one who notices is what saves you." He let that sit for a moment. The idea that something as absurd and mundane as shouting through a window had been enough to tether her and him to the world in their own strange ways. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Of course." "Why the squirrels?" Margaret smiled again, softer this time. "Because they don't expect much. They show up, they take what they need, and they leave. No judgment, no obligation. Just a simple transaction of kindness." "That's bleak." "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's honest. The world's complicated. People disappoint. But animals, they remind you that life still moves forward, even when everything else stands still." He leaned back in his chair, thinking about her words, about the small bench under the oak tree, about the way the squirrels would dart forward and freeze, watching him with wary curiosity. He had spent years trying to avoid being part of anything, and here was this woman, building connection out of the smallest rituals imaginable, feeding squirrels, a daily wave, an unanswered yell, and yet it was more than most people ever gave each other. As the afternoon light dimmed outside the hospital window, Ethan stood to leave. He had stayed longer than he intended. Margaret, still sitting upright, didn't seem tired, but he knew the energy required to hold conversation could take more from her than she let on. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "You'd better be," she replied. "The squirrels will want to report." He smiled, nodding, and turned to go. Just as he reached the door, she called out, "Ethan?" He looked back. "There's something I left for you, when I knew I'd be gone a while. It's in the bench, under the seat. A little box. I didn't know if you'd notice, but now I think you're ready for it." He nodded slowly, unsure what to say. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Mr. Window." Margaret came home on a Thursday morning, just after 7 o'clock. Ethan didn't see her arrival, but he heard the quiet creak of her back gate and the soft shuffle of her familiar footsteps in the grass. He was sitting on his kitchen step, a half-empty mug of coffee beside him, watching the squirrels scurry between branches. He had already left the usual offering of peanuts at the base of the oak, and for once, he hadn't written a note. He didn't need to. The past week had spoken louder than any letter he could write. When he looked up, she was there, standing a few feet away from the tree, dressed in a thick wool cardigan and the same lavender hat she always wore. Her tote bag hung from one arm, though it sagged more now, as if its content were lighter or its purpose less urgent. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear, alert, and fixed on him. She didn't speak immediately. Neither did he, for a long moment. They simply looked at one another, two familiar strangers reintroduced in the soft light of morning. The squirrels, sensing no danger, continued their usual chaos beneath the tree. Ethan stood and walked toward her slowly, uncertain whether to offer help, conversation, or just presence. "You're early," he said. "You're quiet," she replied with a small, approving nod. He gestured toward the bench. "You up for sitting?" "Only if you don't expect me to race you there." Together, they made the short walk to the bench, her with deliberate steps, him matching her pace without comment. Once seated, she adjusted her cardigan and let out a long breath, the kind that comes not from exhaustion, but from arriving somewhere that feels deserved. "I missed this," she said. "So did I." For a few minutes, they said nothing more. The sounds around them took over. The rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a blue jay, the soft scuttle of small feet on bark. It was the same place it had always been, but now it felt different, like the silence between them had transformed from tension into understanding. "You said you left something here," Ethan said after a while. She nodded. "Under the bench. Far back. I didn't know if you'd even come looking." "I didn't. You told me." "Even better," she said. "Shows you're finally listening." He leaned forward and reached beneath the wooden slats of the bench. His fingers found a small metal box, rusted slightly at the corners but intact. When he pulled it out, Margaret watched him with a mixture of amusement and something deeper, something like pride. Inside the box were several items, an old photograph folded at the edges, a short stack of index cards held together with a rubber band, and a small cloth pouch tied shut with a faded ribbon. Ethan looked up at her, waiting for permission. "The cards first," she said. He opened the bundle and began to flip through them. Each card was labeled at the top with a date in a simple phrase. First morning, he shouted. Rainy day, he forgot. Waved instead of yelling. Beneath each heading was a line or two, short observations written in Margaret's looping, deliberate handwriting. He seems less angry today. Maybe it's just the coffee. Not sure if he knows I'm real. Might still think I'm a ghost. He didn't yell, just stared. Something must have happened. Ethan blinked slowly, absorbing each card as if translating a language he hadn't realized he'd been speaking all along. "You kept track," he said. "I journaled you," she replied, smiling. "My own little daily soap opera." He laughed, but there was something tight in his chest. Why? Because you were there. Because you made noise. Because I needed a reason to keep watching. He held the stack gently, reverently, and the pouch. She nodded toward it. He untied the ribbon and opened it carefully. Inside were acorns, real, smooth, some with caps still attached, others worn at the edges. I started collecting them when I moved in, she said. That oak has been here longer than both our houses. Thought maybe someday I'd do something with them. A project, a craft. I never got around to it. Ethan rolled one between his fingers. They're perfect. They're ordinary. That's what I liked about them. He looked again into the box, now nearly empty, and pulled out the photograph. It was old, sun-bleached, showing a younger Margaret standing beside a man in military dress, both of them smiling beside the very same tree. The bench was newer in the picture, its paint unchipped. There were no squirrels in the frame, just a couple in the tree, their hands nearly touching but not quite. That your husband? She nodded. William. He planted that bench the year before he died. Said it was for watching, not for sitting. I told him that was nonsense, and we argued about it every fall. Ethan smiled. You won, clearly. Eventually. That's the secret to any argument. You just have to outlive your opponent. They sat there for a long time, the box now closed and resting between them. The air smelled faintly of soil and bark. A squirrel approached cautiously, sniffed at Margaret's shoes, then darted away again. You ever think about moving? He asked, not knowing exactly why. Once, she said, after William died. But the tree kept me here. And the hope that someone else would notice it someday. I didn't notice the tree, Ethan admitted. I just noticed you. Same thing, she said. Eventually. They didn't feed the squirrels that morning. Instead, they watched them the way children might watch a magician's hands. Curious, alert, unsure whether they were witnessing something ordinary or miraculous. The bench, for once, was not a stage or a place of exile. It was simply shared. As the sun climbed higher, Margaret stood with some effort. Ethan offered an arm, which she accepted. They walked back to her door slowly, each step deliberate, both aware that this moment, this quiet cooperation, was something they might never have imagined a year ago. When they reached her porch, she paused and turned to him. Tomorrow, I'll bring the coffee, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Not the shouting? He grinned. No promises. She laughed, and the sound lingered in the morning air even after she disappeared inside. The next morning, at precisely 7:10, Ethan was already seated on the bench, 2 paper cups of coffee in hand. Margaret emerged with her tote bag, now empty, save for habit, and joined him without a word. They fed the squirrels together. Then they didn't. Sometimes they just sat. Sometimes they talked. But every morning, without fail, they met at the tree, 2 stubborn souls who had finally learned how to share the silence. Because sometimes all it takes is a note, a pause, and a peanut to turn strangers into something else entirely.